Welcome to this tour of Brooklyn Heights and Cobble Hill, a historic area of New York City. I am standing at the top on the promenade, which is a high point in Brooklyn Heights. Brooklyn Heights, you should understand, is part of Cobble Hill, and this area I consider in the shape of a challah. And the points of interest we will visit today are what I call raisins in the challah, Jewish sites of interest in the area. Now, to start my history, I'm going to go back a long time and cover much more than just Jewish points, but they will all connect. Let's start 18,000 years ago. This area was the site of the receding glacier. And as the glacier receded, it left in its wake rocky stubble. This rocky stubble extended from here and made this area a height and extended all the way out to the North Fork of Long Island. Along this spine of rubble, many Jewish cemeteries were located because, after all, this rubble could not be used for farming or other use. So this spiny rubble was called a burial belt. Nevertheless, let's get back to Brooklyn Heights. This rubble is called a moraine. It's the Harbor Hill moraine. In 1524, as Verrazano navigated through the Narrows down that way, the Narrows are crossed today by the Verrazano Bridge. As Verrazano went through the Narrows, navigated through the Narrows on behalf of France, looking for a northwest passage to Asia, he was met by Lenape Indians, the first inhabitants of this area. They came out to meet him in their canoes. The Lenape then, 100 years later, in 1636, they sold land to Dutch settlers. By 1646, these Dutch settlements in Brooklyn Heights and the surrounding area were chartered by the Dutch West India Company as the province of Brooklyn, spelled Breukelen. The Dutch West India Company is very important in the history of the Jews of Brooklyn and New York. Let's go back to 1654. Portugal and Spain were at war, and Portugal conquered Brazil. Well, in Brazil, in the city of Recife, there were Dutch Jewish settlers, and they realized they had better get back to Holland before the Portuguese took over. So they chartered a vessel on the way back to Holland. Along the way, they were attacked by pirates. The pirates took them hostage, sank their ship, and took all their possessions. But they were rescued. A French privateer attacked the pirate ship, rescued the Dutch settlers, and took them back to Holland. On the way, the French ship had to stop in New Amsterdam. In New Amsterdam, the French captain demanded payment for passage. The Jews did not have payment for passage. The pirates took all their possessions. They had very little left. All their possessions were auctioned off by order of the Dutch New Amsterdam court to pay the French captain, and they were stranded. Well, the Dutch West India Company came to their rescue. It sent over 5 Jewish families of some means. These Jewish families paid the debt, and the Jewish settlers from Recife were free. They remained. Governor Stuyvesant wanted them expelled. Governor Stuyvesant wanted anyone who was not of the Dutch Reformed religion expelled. That was true not just of Jews, it was true of Catholics, it was true of other Protestant sects as well. However, once again, the Dutch West India Company pressured him to allow the Jews to remain. They became citizens, and they became the first Sephardic Jewish elite of New York. Shearith Israel Synagogue is their synagogue. Among their famous heirs was Justice Benjamin Cardozo and Emma Lazarus, all descendants of those original Jewish settlers. In addition, one of the Jewish settlers, Asher Levy, bought property in Brooklyn, and that's what takes this tour over the river into Brooklyn. Now, why was Brooklyn such a good place, and Brooklyn Heights such a good place for settlement? It was a high ridge. It was a perfect suburb for people to live who went to work in Manhattan. The East River was incredibly navigable, which explains why General George Washington was able to retreat after his defeat in the Revolutionary War. He was able to retreat in dense fog in the dead of night across the East River, and he saved his army in that way. This area and the settlers would go by ferry to Manhattan, and the ferry was started, of course, by the Clinton steamboat. In time, other ferries took routes along the East River. There was a route from Fulton Ferry to Atlantic Avenue. There was a route from Montague Street, and so those routes then, in time, became the routes of the subway system, because these are the closest points between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Well, let's just talk about this. This area was ripe for residential use because it was above the seaport, the commercial seaport, and it was above the downtown Brooklyn area where all the subway lines were built, elevated lines at the time were built. And so it was a perfect residential community. There are many beautiful residences in Brooklyn Heights and Cobble Hill, in the revival styles. And now we are going to leave this beautiful promenade where down below we can see in the distance the Narrows with the Verrazano Bridge and the East River from down here at Battery Park up through the Brooklyn Bridge. And we're going to go to the first raisin in the challah. And that is the first stop on our tour. We are standing in the courtyard of the Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims. What makes this church the raisin in the challah is that is its pulpit. This was the pulpit of Henry Ward Beecher, the famed abolitionist, who preached here in favor of the abolition of slavery. What is distinctive about Henry Ward Beecher is that he was a famous Philo-Semite. He delivered a sermon entitled Gentile and Jew, delivered in 1876. Many newspapers printed it, and it became an influential Philo-Semitic tract. This sermon was clergyman Beecher's reaction to an anti-Semitic incident that took place at the Grand Hotel in Saratoga. In 1876, a Jewish financier named Joseph Seligman, with a remarkable rags to riches biography, he was an immigrant peddler, a Civil War uniform manufacturer, a successful financier. In fact, his plans for refinancing the Civil War debt were adopted by President Rutherford B. Hayes. Anyway, in 1876, he took his family up to Saratoga to spend a vacation at a hotel, the Grand Union Hotel, owned by the estate of the department store magnate A.T. Stewart. Seligman belonged to a group opposed to Tammany Hall, opposed to the corrupt Tweed Ring, and he was resented by Judge Henry Hilton, a member of that ring who was administering the Stewart estate. Hilton claimed that the hotel was losing Christian patronage because of its Israelite guests. Outraged, Pastor Beecher preached a sermon stating that, "When I heard of the unnecessary offense that has been cast upon Mr. Seligman, I felt no other person could have been singled out that would have brought home to me the injustice more sensibly than he." There was nationwide shock over this incident. The Stewart department store was boycotted, and Judge Hilton was excoriated and shunned. Nevertheless, it was the template for an anti-Semitic pattern of signs posted on hotel entries stating, "Hebrews need not apply." This manifestation of anti-Semitism is the topic of the novel and movie Gentleman's Agreement, which you can view on Amazon Prime. This 8-acre park, part of Robert Moses' vision for a new Brooklyn Civic Center, is named for another Protestant spiritual leader, S. Parks Cadman. He too was a remarkable Philo-Semite. He was an outspoken opponent of anti-Semitism. He was the leader of the Central Congregational Church from 1901 to 1936. He broadcast his teachings over the radio and wrote newspaper columns. He co-founded the National Conference of Christians and Jews, which was dedicated to opposing Nazism, the Ku Klux Klan, anti-Catholicism, and anti-Semitism. We are at the site of the former congregation Mount Sinai. It was incorporated as Chevra Mount Sinai in 1882. Like the Kane Street Synagogue of Cobble Hill, organized earlier in 1856, its members were mainly shopkeepers owning stores on Myrtle and Atlantic Avenues and Columbia and Fulton Streets. In 1982, it sold its building on Schermerhorn Street to the Unification Church and moved here as this complex had just opened. It remains here until the end of 2022 when it lost its lease. It's now leading a nomadic existence, and we certainly hope it finds itself a home soon. We are now at another raisin in the Holla, the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue at 131 Remsen Street. This was founded in 1959 by a small group of Jewish Heights residents, among them Fanny and Ira Mailer, parents of the author Norman Mailer. They moved to the Heights in the 1940s. There were few Jews in the neighborhood at the time. I chatted with Fanny Mailer at a UJA luncheon in 1979, and she described for me how she succeeded, despite neighborhood anti-Semitism, to convince a building superintendent to rent her an apartment. She told him and impressed him by telling him she had a son at Harvard and a daughter at Radcliffe. Parenthetically, the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood has been home to several distinguished authors, both Jewish and Christian. The list includes W.H. Auden, Truman Capote, and in addition to Norman Mailer, Norman Rustin and Arthur Miller. When Arthur Miller was married to Marilyn Monroe, he lived on Grace Court, but at one time he also lived on Monroe Place. The first building owned by this synagogue was down the block at 117 Remsen Street. In 1996, it sold that structure to Synagogue B'nai Avraham and purchased its present home, formerly the Brooklyn Club. It has recently raised up to now almost $9 million for an expansion to 127 Remsen Street. It currently has approximately 500 members, making it the largest synagogue in the area. Hi, we are now standing in front of 117 Remsen Street, B'nai Avraham Synagogue. At the end of this tour, we will visit the Kane Street Synagogue, the oldest synagogue in Brooklyn. It is known as the Mother Synagogue, as so many of its members would found other synagogues in Brooklyn when they moved away from the area. B'nai Avraham was formed by a member who did not move, but who did not accept Kane Street Synagogue's decision in 1988 to engage a female rabbi. After holding services in a private home on Remsen Street and in various other spaces, it purchased this building from the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue in 1996 and now is a thriving modern Orthodox synagogue, complete with a mikveh, a Hebrew school, and a preschool. On January 22nd, 1856, a group of 12 Bavarian, Dutch, and Portuguese Jews met at the home of a Mr. B. Ross on Myrtle Avenue and incorporated Congregation Beth Israel, the oldest synagogue in Brooklyn. They rented space right here at 155 Atlantic Avenue. This pizza parlor is the same spot, and it's the same configuration as the synagogue itself. As the minutes of their first meeting state, an earnest desire was manifested among some Jewish residents of Brooklyn to effect the incorporation of a congregation and synagogue for divine service. Within 5 years, their congregation had grown to 35 members, and they decided to build a sanctuary. That will be the next stop on our tour. Within 5 years after their incorporation in 1856, the congregation had grown to 35 members, and they decided to build a sanctuary. They purchased 2 lots on the southeast corner of Borum Place and State Street for $3,000. On January 12, 1862, a cornerstone was laid, and by August, a synagogue had been completed at a cost of $10,000. In the words of Rabbi Goldfarb, the congregation's first historian, it was the first altar dedicated to the God of Israel to be built on all of Long Island. The shul was near a stable of racehorses. Soon it was reported that loud praying was disturbing the horses. Our member, Civil War hero Leopold Charles Newman was born in July 26, 1839. Leopold was 16 when his mother died, 9 days after she gave birth to his sister Victoria. Newman lived with his father and sister at 177 Court Street. We are standing alongside 177 Court Street now. On May 27, 1861, just 6 weeks after the fall of Fort Sumter, Newman and 2 close friends were among the first to enlist in the 31st Infantry Regiment of New York Volunteers. Although he was only 22 when Newman enlisted, he was engaged to be married, he was an attorney, and he was known as a good orator, a man of ability and a lawyer of merit and distinction. More importantly, he displayed leadership, for he was a founding member of the Young Men's Democratic Association of Brooklyn. Unlike Manhattan Democrats, the Democrats of Brooklyn, chief among them Walt Whitman, supported the war. Newman was commissioned as a lieutenant in Company B of the 31st Regiment, Newman's Company B engaged in 16 battles in Virginia. It fought at Fairfax Courthouse, Blackburn's Ford, Bull Run, Munson's Hill, Springfield Station, West Point, Gaines Mill, Garnet and Golding's Farm, Glendale, Malvern Hill, Burke Station, Fredericksburg, and Mary's Heights and Salem Church. In Maryland, it battled at Crampton's Pass, and Antietam. Newman was in every one of these battles, and he achieved the rank of lieutenant colonel by 2 promotions earned for valor. With only a few weeks left to serve, he returned home on leave, only to be peremptorily recalled. "I'll be home in a week, Father," he said, as he returned to Virginia for a battle at Fredericksburg. There, General Sedgwick ordered the 31st to carry Mary's Heights, saying, "You may lose all your men, but you will save the corps." Newman, turning to his men, cried, Now, gentlemen, over with you." And with banner in one hand and sword in the other, he dashed into a fight. The charge was successful, with the 31st Regiment making 2 of the most brilliant charges of the entire campaign, and their flag the first to reach the rebels' works. But Newman suffered a severe grape-shot wound in his left foot. The shot broke several bones. At that time, such an injury required amputation. The pain of surgery could be ameliorated only by surgical speed, for there was never enough chloroform to go around. With skill, a leg could be removed in 12 seconds, an arm in 9. It is not clear if Newman was operated on in the field or in National Hotel in Washington, D.C., to which he was evacuated. He died there on June 7th. President Abraham Lincoln arrived at Newman's bedside, either as he lay dying or just after he died, and reportedly delivered to him his commission as a brigadier general. Newman was buried with military honors in our synagogue's first cemetery. His tombstone read, "He fought for his country with the Army of the Potomac in every battle, from Bull Run to that in which he fell, leading his regiment in the storming of Mary's Heights." We now come to the plumpest raisin in the hollow, 236 Kane Street. By the early 1900s, members had dwindled to 30 in Congregation Beth Israel on Borum Place, and the synagogue's existence was in jeopardy. The extension of mass transit to sections of East and South Brooklyn enabled Jews to live further from Manhattan than the downtown area, and there was dissension within the congregation between Reform and Orthodox factions. There was a consensus that they needed a better building to attract new members. Thereupon, in 1905, they sold the building for $14,000 to the Scandinavian Good Templars of Greater New York, a fraternal temperance society, and purchased from Trinity Lutheran Church a complex of 3 buildings, which you see behind me, on the corner of Tompkins Place and Kane Street, which was then named Harrison Street, for $30,000. It was paid with the proceeds of the Borum Shul sale, donations of $3,000, and assumption of the church's $13,000 mortgage. The 3 buildings were a beautiful 864-seat house of worship, complete with a balcony, a small kitchen building alongside it, and a large meeting house. In that same year, the congregation hired Rabbi Israel Goldfarb, who became famous as the father of synagogue choral music. He composed the well-known and universally sung tune to the Sholem Aleichem Friday evening prayer. He encouraged Aaron Copeland and the son of synagogue president Harris Copeland to pursue his musical ambitions. Rabbi Goldfarb served the congregation faithfully from 1905 to 1965. Down at the end of Tompkins Place was 140 DeGraw Street, a small residence occupied by another synagogue, Talmud Torah Anshe Emes. It was outgrowing its space, and so in 1908 it merged with Beit Israel to form Congregation Beit Israel Anshe Emes. Thereafter, the size of the congregation waxed and waned, but its leaders, without exception, devoted themselves to keeping the synagogue alive. It has now reached its 167th year. Despite the temporary setback of COVID-19, it is going strong.